Today's review is Legacy by Hugo Jackson. A character-driven fantasy epic, Legacy follows the story of Faria Farako, daughter of the Emperor of Zayal and a resonator. Capable of manipulating the elements via rare crystals, she is one of the few capable of mastering this unique and powerful ability. When the Draka, a race of red-scaled dragons, discover an ancient artifact from the fabled city of Nazriel, they waste little time before attacking Zayal in search of their goals. On the run and desperate to find her father, Faria begins a journey that will take her to the land of Skyria in search of answers. The characters in Legacy are led by Faria, a young fox empress-to-be who begins the story somewhat sheltered by her position, who is taken by surprise when Zayal is attacked at the beginning of the story. Forced to go on the run with little initial support, she does so with her father's staff as her only protection. Overall, I liked Faria. I found her an enjoyable protagonist who was very sympathetic and likable. Personally, I was hoping she would take a bit more of an active role in the narrative, being more swept along with events than directing them herself, but that's more of a wishlist item than any sort of criticism. Joining her on her adventure is Taranin, a partially mechanical raccoon with some prosthesis attached in place of missing parts. Now, I don't want to describe him as cybernetic or a cyborg, even though those terms technically apply because they're more in the sci-fi wheelhouse than fantasy. Nevertheless, I won't spoil how they meet, but I will say that he, at least for me, was probably the most fun character out of the entire cast, kind of being a little brother to Faria, and just a breath of fresh air for how he interacted with the rest of the group. From what I've heard, he's definitely popular among other readers, and is arguably the book's breakout character if there is one. At their first real stop, they recruit Aaron and Kairu, who for the purposes of this review I'll discuss together. A bit of a will-they, won't-they sort of relationship, it's clear from the start that they're more than just simple partners. I'm not exactly sure what term I'd use to describe them, but they agree to escort Faria and Taranin to their destination, and from there they become a quartet. For the most part, I was pretty happy with how these two characters developed, and I'd like to direct special attention to the interactions between Taranin and Kairu, which more than a few times made me smile. The last major character to be introduced is that of Osiris, the armor-wearing griffin who shows up when Faria initially attempts to secure passage to Skyria. Brave, resourceful, and unwavering in his determination, he becomes one of Faria's strongest allies. Throughout the course of the book, the author does a good job of establishing the world and the players in it, taking advantage of the plot to show the different places of the story setting and how it all fits together. There are some I would have liked to see more of, had the opportunity permitted, but there's always the possibility of that down the road. For the most part, I feel that the plot moved along well, with a lot of the beats coming at the right moments. Although I don't necessarily know if I'd call this an issue, my only potential critique is with regards to the ending. While it was resolved with a satisfactory amount of action, I feel that the conclusion of the book was a little abrupt in that after the antagonist is defeated and the world is saved, the book effectively ends with little attention paid to the aftermath of the book's events. Now, while the conclusion was placed in what I would call the first endpoint, that is, the first point where you could have called it the end, I really feel like it would have been better served had there been one more chapter or an epilogue showing life returning to normal, Faria is adjusting to the concept of taking over Zayal, and what happened to Taranin, whose fate was left ambiguous. Of course, I accept the possibility that this may have been plot points reserved for a future book, but whether that's the case or not, I still think that we could have used a little more resolution before the curtain fell. Now, while my overall impression of the book was very positive, there were a few things that I thought slightly decreased my overall experience. And I want to preface this by saying that my experience is probably not typical because as a fellow author, I tend to notice things like this more than I feel the average reader would, so take my comments with a grain of salt. Early on in the book, there's a scene during the initial attack on Zayal in which Faria identifies Vionica in internal dialogue before there is any reasonable way she could have come across this information. It is not suggested they already knew each other, nor was it mentioned in dialogue prior to that point where she would have overheard it, so this is a minor inconsistency. The second issue I had was towards the conclusion of the book, where a mechanical, non-anthro bird that was Taranin's companion throughout a fair amount of the story reveals its betrayal and apologizes before inducing him to crush it. The issue I had with this was the fact that prior to this, we were given no indication that it was capable of speech, much less independent thought beyond a set of behavioral programming, nor was it suggested that a sentient intelligence was operating by remote, so I sort of thought it a bit unusual when it suddenly becomes capable of much more advanced behavior than previously indicated, without any explanation provided. And the last thing that struck me as a minor issue was that at times the POV shifts rather abruptly, in that there is no space or other indicator that the POV is changing, and while it did occur to me the author might have been using third-person omniscient, The way the story was worded, it felt more like third-person limited, which means that whichever character is chosen as the point-of-view character can only discuss their own thoughts and feelings, and beyond that, only what they can determine from their own 5 senses. At times, the story would jump from one to another without a scene break, or describe things in such a way that there was no way the point-of-view character could have been aware of it. Overall, I found Legacy to be a very enjoyable book and well worth the time to read. I highly recommend it.
Thanks for watching, and if you liked it, click the subscribe button and leave a comment below. You can also find me on Twitter and a few other places on the web, or support me via Patreon or Ko-fi. Zebra hugs!